14 years after losing her family, Hannah Mercer left the orphanage believing she had no one left in the world. But waiting for her was an abandoned apple orchard, a grandmother she thought had forgotten her, and one final letter that led to a hidden cellar beneath an old cider mill. What she uncovered there would expose a secret powerful companies had tried to bury for decades, and prove that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the truth someone sacrificed everything to protect. The Cascade Mountains stood silent beneath the coldest winter in more than 30 years. Endless snow covered the forests around Leavenworth, while icy wind carried crystals through towering pines beneath a pale gray dawn. Hannah Mercer had spent most of her life wondering what it felt like to belong somewhere. On the morning she turned 23, that question still had no answer. She stood outside the Evergreen Transitional Youth Center, holding two faded suitcases that contained everything she owned. Behind her, the brick building where she had lived since she was 9 slowly disappeared beneath drifting snow. Ahead of her stretched an empty parking lot, a bus station 3 miles away, and a future she had never learned how to imagine. She was neither short nor particularly tall, standing about 5'7" with a lean frame shaped less by exercise than by years of learning to take care of herself. Her long chestnut brown hair rested beneath a dark wool beanie, escaping in loose strands that danced in the freezing wind. Clear blue-gray eyes gave her a thoughtful appearance, though those who knew her well recognized the caution hidden behind them. Fair skin, lightly freckled across the bridge of her nose, turned pink in the cold. She rarely smiled for strangers. Growing up inside foster homes had taught her that promises often disappeared faster than people. Trust, once broken enough times, became something she offered only in tiny pieces. Even so, Hannah possessed a quiet kindness that refused to disappear. She volunteered in the center's small library, helped younger children with homework, and repaired old furniture simply because she disliked seeing useful things thrown away. One of the counselors once told her she had inherited the strange habit of fixing broken objects because she secretly hoped people could be repaired the same way. At exactly 9 o'clock, the center's front door opened. Margaret Doyle stepped outside carrying a thick brown envelope. Margaret was 63, the senior social worker who had watched dozens of teenagers begin adult life with more fear than confidence. Her silver hair curled gently beneath a knitted hat, and soft green eyes reflected years spent comforting children whose stories rarely ended happily. Though small in stature, she possessed remarkable emotional strength. Hannah often joked that Margaret could calm a thunderstorm simply by speaking to it. "I almost missed you," Margaret said, breathing carefully in the cold. "I wasn't planning on making a dramatic exit." "You never do." Margaret handed her the envelope. "It arrived 20 minutes ago." Hannah frowned. "I don't know anyone who writes letters." Apparently, someone did. The envelope carried the name of a law office in Spokane. Inside rested several neatly folded documents and one handwritten letter attached with a paperclip. Hannah immediately noticed the surname written across the first page. Mercer, her own surname. For several long seconds, she simply stared without speaking. She had spent 14 years believing there were no more Mercers left. "My grandmother?" she whispered. Margaret nodded slowly. "The attorney called while you were packing." Hannah unfolded the legal documents with trembling fingers. They confirmed that Evelyn Grace Mercer, age 84, had passed away peacefully 3 months earlier at her family orchard near Leavenworth, Washington. The next page stopped Hannah's breathing. 80 acres. An orchard, a century-old farmhouse, a cider mill, storage buildings. Everything had been transferred into her name. She laughed softly, but there was no happiness in it. "This has to be a mistake." Margaret gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "The attorney confirmed your identity twice." Hannah lowered her eyes toward the handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The handwriting appeared careful but uneven, as though every sentence required effort. She hesitated before unfolding it. Anger rose faster than curiosity. For years, she had imagined the woman who had never visited birthdays, never answered questions, never came when she cried herself to sleep after another foster family said goodbye. Now that woman wanted to leave her a farm. It felt almost insulting. The letter contained only one paragraph. "If these words have reached you, then time has finally run out for me. I know you have every reason to hate my silence, and I won't ask you to forgive it yet. But before you decide what kind of woman I was, please do one thing. When you reach the orchard, go to the old cider mill. Beneath its floor is a cellar. Open it before anyone else does. Everything you deserve to know has been waiting there for you." Hannah read the words twice. Then a third time. There was no explanation, no apology, only a request. She folded the letter slowly, her heartbeat echoing louder than the winter wind outside. Somewhere beyond the frozen mountains of Washington stood an orchard she had never seen, and beneath it waited a secret that a dying woman believed was more important than anything else she could have left behind. Margaret quietly waited while Hannah slipped the letter back into its envelope. Neither woman spoke for nearly a minute. Snow drifted across the empty parking lot, covering the footprints Hannah had left only moments earlier. Finally, Margaret reached into her coat pocket and handed over a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. "The attorney asked me to give you this too." Hannah examined it. There were no markings except 2 tiny letters carved into the leather. "Yem, Evelyn Mercer," Hannah murmured. Margaret nodded. "He said your grandmother insisted the key stay with the letter." "What does it open?" He didn't know. Hannah closed her fingers around the cold metal. It felt strangely warm despite the freezing air, as though it had been carried by many hands before reaching hers. She wanted to throw it into the snow. She wanted to believe the letter meant nothing. But another feeling had begun pushing against years of resentment. Questions. Questions she had buried almost as deeply as the woman who wrote the letter. "Did she ever try to find me?" Hannah asked quietly. Margaret hesitated. "I honestly don't know." That answer somehow hurt more than certainty. An hour later, Hannah boarded a westbound bus. The trip across Washington lasted nearly 6 hours. The farther they traveled, the taller the mountains became. Snow blanketed frozen rivers, old wooden bridges, and dense evergreen forests until the world outside the window seemed painted in white and silver. Hannah barely noticed the scenery. The envelope rested unopened on her lap, while her thumb traced the edge of the brass key again and again. Every childhood memory returned in fragments. School events where no one came. Birthdays celebrated with donated cakes. Watching other children leave with relatives during holidays while she remained behind. Whenever she had asked about family, the answer had always been painfully simple. No one came. She had accepted that explanation because accepting it hurt less than hoping. Near sunset, the bus finally reached the outskirts of Leavenworth. Waiting beside the small station stood an elderly pickup truck coated with road salt and snow. Leaning against the driver's door was a broad-shouldered older man wrapped in a thick plaid wool jacket. He removed his hat as Hannah approached. "My name's Walter Grayson." Walter appeared to be around 70. He stood just under 6 feet tall with a solid build that years of farm work had never completely worn away. His neatly trimmed white beard framed a weathered face lined by decades of mountain winters, while calm hazel eyes carried the patience of someone who rarely hurried through life. His heavy leather gloves were cracked from years of pruning trees and repairing equipment. Though his voice was deep, it carried an unmistakable gentleness. "I looked after your grandmother's orchard these past few years." Hannah remained cautious. "The lawyer sent you?" Walter nodded. "He asked me to bring you home." Home. The words sounded unfamiliar. She climbed into the old pickup without answering. The drive wound through narrow mountain roads lined with towering pine forests. As darkness settled across the Cascades, Walter pointed toward distant rows of snow-covered trees stretching across the hillsides. "Those are yours now." Hannah stared silently through the window. The orchard seemed endless. Thousands of bare apple trees stood patiently beneath heavy snow, their branches glistening beneath moonlight like frozen silver. Beyond them stood a weathered cedar farmhouse, its warm porch light glowing softly against the darkness. Nearby rested an old red cider mill with a tall stone chimney and a sagging wooden roof that had clearly survived generations of hard winters. "It hasn't changed much," Walter said quietly. "My grandmother lived here alone, for longer than anyone should." His answer lingered in the silence. When the truck stopped, Hannah stepped into snow that reached almost to her boots. The only sound came from wind moving gently through the orchard. She looked toward the old cider mill. Its wooden doors were closed. The brass key inside her pocket suddenly felt heavier than before. Walter carried her suitcases onto the porch before turning back toward her. "Your grandmother left one instruction for me." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "If you arrived." He looked toward the old mill. "I was to let you make your own decision." She followed his gaze. Beneath that weathered building waited a cellar she had never seen. Perhaps answers. Perhaps disappointment. Perhaps another reason to believe she'd been abandoned. Or perhaps something powerful enough that an old woman had guarded it until her very last breath. Hannah tightened her hand around the brass key as snow continued falling across the silent orchard. Tomorrow, she would open the cellar, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The first light of morning spread slowly across the Cascade Mountains, turning the endless snow into a sea of silver while frost clung to every apple branch like tiny crystals waiting for spring. Hannah Mercer barely slept. Long after Walter had retired to the small caretaker's cabin beyond the orchard, she remained awake beside the old stone fireplace, reading Evelyn's short letter over and over. The brass key rested on the kitchen table beside a flickering lantern. It seemed impossible that such a small object could carry the weight of 14 unanswered years. Before sunrise, she wrapped herself in a thick wool coat and stepped into the bitter cold. Every breath became a white cloud. The orchard stretched silently before her, thousands of bare apple trees standing like patient guardians beneath fresh snow. Although winter had stripped away their fruit, Hannah sensed that the land was somehow still alive. She couldn't explain why. The old cider mill stood at the edge of the orchard, its cedar walls darkened by nearly a century of rain, snow, and mountain wind. Rust covered the iron hinges, and one side of the roof sagged beneath years of heavy winters. Yet despite its age, the building possessed a quiet dignity that reminded Hannah of the people who refused to surrender simply because time had become difficult. She unlocked the heavy wooden door. The smell surprised her. Instead of mold or decay, the air carried traces of aged oak barrels, dried apples, cinnamon, and cold stone. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight slipping between weathered roof boards. Massive wooden presses stood motionless where they had last been used years before, their iron wheels frozen in place like forgotten giants. Hannah walked slowly across the creaking floor. She expected to find the hidden cellar immediately. She didn't. For nearly an hour she searched every corner, lifting loose boards, moving old crates, and brushing decades of dust from the floor. Nothing resembled a hidden entrance. Frustration slowly replaced determination. Was this some kind of mistake? She whispered to herself. Just as she prepared to leave, the sound of an engine echoed outside. A dusty green pickup stopped beside the mill. The driver climbed out carrying a toolbox over one shoulder. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, standing just over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders shaped by years of physical labor. His dark brown hair curled slightly beneath a faded baseball cap, while a neatly trimmed beard framed a calm, square jaw. Deep green eyes studied everything before speaking, revealing a patient personality that preferred observation over argument. His flannel jacket carried faint stains from engine oil, tree sap, and cider, evidence that he had spent much of his life fixing machines rather than replacing them. He removed his gloves before approaching. "You must be Hannah Mercer." She straightened immediately. "And you are?" "Ethan Brooks." He extended one calloused hand. "I kept the cider equipment running until the orchard closed." Hannah hesitated before shaking it. "Walter had mentioned no one else. I didn't expect visitors. I wasn't sure you'd come." "You knew my grandmother?" A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. "I worked beside her for almost 12 years." The answer stirred mixed emotions. 12 years. Hannah repeated quietly. "Longer than she ever knew me." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Your grandmother talked about you more than you might believe." Hannah looked away. "I find that difficult to accept." He didn't argue. Instead, he quietly set his toolbox beside one of the old cider presses. "I figured this machine would need attention if anyone ever planned to use it again." His confidence caught Hannah's attention. "You expected someone to reopen the mill?" "I expected Evelyn's plan to eventually find the right person." Silence settled between them. Outside, cold wind whispered through the sleeping orchard. Inside, Hannah looked once more across the ancient wooden floor. If her grandmother had hidden a cellar beneath this building, she was becoming certain that it had been concealed well enough to survive generations. Ethan walked slowly around the old cider press, running one hand across the weathered oak beams as though greeting an old friend. The mill had been silent for nearly 7 years, yet he still knew every loose bolt, every worn gear, and every crack in the stone floor. Hannah watched him carefully. Trust had never come naturally to her. and years in foster care had taught her that strangers often arrived carrying promises they could not keep. Still, there was something different about the quiet confidence in Ethan's movements. He never acted as though the orchard belonged to him. He treated it as though he had merely been protecting it until its rightful owner returned. Without saying a word, Ethan knelt beside one of the massive wooden presses. He brushed away years of dust before tapping 3 floorboards with the handle of a wrench. The first produced a dull thud. The second sounded solid. The third echoed with a deep hollow knock. "There," he said softly. Hannah hurried beside him. Together they slid the heavy cider press a few inches across the floor. Hidden beneath it was a rusted iron ring almost invisible beneath layers of dirt and dried apple pulp. Hannah's heart raced as she inserted the brass key. Evelyn had left her into a small lock hidden inside the ring. The lock clicked. For several seconds neither of them moved. Then Hannah pulled. A square section of the floor slowly lifted, releasing a breath of cool, dry air carrying the unmistakable scent of aged wood and fresh apples. Stone steps disappeared into darkness below. Lantern in hand, Hannah descended first. The cellar was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of treasure chests or forgotten valuables, rows of handcrafted oak shelves stretched along the walls. Hundreds of glass jars filled with apple seeds rested inside carefully labeled wooden boxes. Nearby stood dozens of old barrels, hand-built cider presses, pruning tools polished by decades of use, and leather-bound journals stacked with extraordinary care. Everything had been preserved. Everything had been waiting. Hannah picked up the nearest journal. Inside were pages covered with Evelyn's precise handwriting. Every season had been recorded in remarkable detail. Weather patterns, harvest dates, pollination notes, soil conditions, and careful observations about dozens of heirloom apple varieties that no longer appeared in commercial orchards. Another notebook contained sketches of rare apples with names Hannah had never heard before. Winter Gold, Crimson Hollow, Blue Ridge Sweet, Mountain Amber. Each variety included tasting notes, disease resistance, flowering cycles, and handwritten comments explaining why Evelyn refused to sell them to large agricultural corporations. They wanted patents, Ethan said quietly after reading over Hannah's shoulder. She looked up. "What do you mean?" "They wanted to own these varieties." He pointed toward another shelf. "Your grandmother believed fruit should belong to families and farmers, not corporations." Hannah slowly closed the journal. For the first time since arriving, her anger weakened. Not because she understood everything, but because she realized Evelyn had spent decades protecting something far greater than a piece of land. As they climbed back into the mill, Ethan led Hannah toward the rear storage barn. Inside stood hundreds of wooden crates overflowing with oddly shaped apples stored in carefully controlled cold rooms. Some were too small. Others carried unusual colors or imperfect skin. "They're beautiful," Hannah whispered. "They're rejected," Ethan answered with a faint smile. "Rejected. Every one of them." He picked up a deep crimson apple with golden streaks. Too small for supermarkets. Another. Too irregular. Another. Wrong color. Hannah stared in disbelief. They threw all of these away? They refused to buy them. She polished one apple against her sleeve before taking a cautious bite. The crisp sweetness exploded with rich floral flavors unlike any apple she had tasted before. Her eyes widened. "This is incredible." Ethan nodded. "Your grandmother used to say supermarkets judge apples with their eyes." He smiled gently. "But people remember them with their hearts." Outside, the afternoon sun settled behind the snow-covered Cascade Mountains, casting long golden shadows across the silent orchard. Hannah looked from the forgotten apples to the ancient cider mill, then back toward the hidden cellar below. For the first time in 14 years, she no longer felt like someone searching for a place to belong. She felt like someone standing at the beginning of a purpose that had been waiting for her long before she ever arrived. A powerful snowstorm swept across the Cascade Mountains during the night, burying the orchard beneath another foot of fresh snow while icy wind rattled the old cider mill until dawn. Hannah Mercer awoke to the sound of branches scraping gently against the farmhouse windows. The journals she and Ethan had carried from the hidden cellar the previous evening lay spread across the kitchen table beside steaming mugs of coffee. Sleep had been impossible. Every page revealed another forgotten apple variety, another careful observation written in Evelyn's elegant handwriting. Another reminder that the grandmother Hannah had spent years resenting had quietly devoted her life to protecting something far greater than an orchard. Ethan arrived shortly after sunrise carrying a toolbox and a bundle of firewood. He stamped the snow from his boots before stepping inside. "You've been reading all night," he observed. Hannah nodded. "I thought I'd find family stories. And instead, a library." She gently touched one of the leather journals. "I don't think she was preserving apples." Ethan smiled faintly. No. What was she preserving? The future. The answer lingered between them. After breakfast, they walked through the orchard, checking broken branches left by the storm. The wind had knocked several young trees sideways, but most of Evelyn's century-old apple trees stood firm. Their twisted trunks looked almost ancient beneath the fresh snow, as though they had survived storms far worse than this one. Near the western edge of the property, something caught Hannah's attention. Fresh tire tracks. They weren't here yesterday. Ethan immediately crouched beside them. Heavy truck tires. Recently made. They stopped at the fence. Both followed the tracks until they reached the old property line. The wire fence had been cut cleanly in one section. Not broken. Cut. Beyond it, several footprints disappeared toward a small maintenance shed that Evelyn had rarely used during her final years. The wooden door stood slightly open. Inside, everything appeared untouched except for one shelf. Dust had been disturbed recently. Someone had searched the room. "They were looking for something," Hannah whispered. Ethan's expression darkened. "They came after the storm." "How can you tell?" "The snow covered yesterday's tracks. These were made overnight." Before Hannah could answer, another sound echoed across the valley. An expensive black SUV slowly climbed the orchard road. It stopped beside the farmhouse. A tall man stepped out wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat that looked completely out of place among snowdrifts and muddy boots. He appeared to be in his early 50s, standing nearly 6'3", with neatly combed silver-black hair, clean-shaven features, and sharp blue eyes that rarely revealed emotion. His polished shoes remained surprisingly clean despite the snow. Every movement reflected confidence built from decades of boardrooms rather than orchards. He approached with a practiced smile. "Miss Mercer, I presume." Hannah remained still. "Who are you?" He extended a leather business card. "Victor Langford." She glanced at it. "Cascade Agricultural Holdings. I've been hoping we'd finally meet." His voice was warm. His eyes were not. "I was a long-time business associate of your grandmother." Ethan quietly folded his arms. "Funny." Victor looked toward him. "Why?" "Because Evelyn never mentioned you." For the first time, Victor's smile faded almost imperceptibly. He recovered instantly. "I imagine she mentioned very few business matters." He turned back toward Hannah. "I understand inheriting an orchard this size can feel overwhelming. I'm managing." "I'm sure you are." He paused. "Nevertheless, my company would be interested in purchasing the property." Hannah answered immediately. "It isn't for sale." Victor nodded politely, almost expecting the response. "I encourage you not to decide too quickly." He removed a folded survey map from his briefcase and placed it on the hood of his SUV. "Most people believe this orchard's value comes from its fruit." He looked directly into Hannah's eyes. "It doesn't." Without another word, he climbed back into the vehicle. The SUV disappeared down the snowy road, leaving only fresh tire tracks behind. Hannah stared after it. Then she slowly looked toward the old cider mill, toward the hidden cellar beneath it, toward the journals Evelyn had protected until her final breath. A cold realization settled over her. Victor Langford hadn't come to buy apples. He had come for something buried much deeper. Victor Langford's black SUV disappeared beyond the snow-covered pines, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering above the valley. Hannah remained standing beside the tire tracks, her gloved hand still resting on the folded survey map Victor had abandoned. Ethan quietly unfolded it across the hood of Walter's pickup after returning from the western fence. Something immediately caught his attention. The colored survey lines didn't stop at the orchard. They extended beneath the farmhouse, the cider mill, and even the hidden cellar. "Look at this," Ethan said. Hannah leaned closer. A narrow blue line crossed the entire property before disappearing beneath the neighboring hills. "What's that?" Ethan frowned. "It isn't marked as a stream." Walter, who had just arrived carrying replacement fencing materials, removed his glasses and studied the map for nearly a minute. "I've seen this symbol before." Both turned toward him. "It marks underground spring systems." Hannah looked up. My grandmother never mentioned a spring. Walter nodded slowly. Because she rarely talked about anything she wanted protected. Back inside the farmhouse, they searched through another stack of Evelyn's journals. Most described apple harvests and weather patterns, but one notebook, wrapped in faded blue cloth, contained something entirely different. Instead of orchard records, every page showed hand-drawn geological sketches. Beneath the orchard, Evelyn had carefully mapped an ancient underground aquifer fed by snowmelt flowing through volcanic basalt beneath the Cascade Mountains. Notes written over 25 years explained that the spring's unique mineral balance gave the orchard's heirloom apples their unusually rich flavor and natural resistance to disease. Near the final page, Hannah discovered a folded letter addressed only with 2 words. If they return. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. If someone offers more money than this orchard appears to be worth, they are not buying trees. They are searching for what lies beneath them. Never separate the land from its water, because together they create something that cannot be replaced. No signature was needed. Hannah already recognized Evelyn's careful handwriting. Suddenly Victor's visit made perfect sense. It isn't just the apples, she whispered. Ethan nodded. It's the water that keeps them alive. That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. A white county truck rolled slowly into the driveway. From it stepped Dr. Naomi Ellis, a 56-year-old hydrologist working with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. She was of average height with silver-streaked black hair tied into a low ponytail, warm brown eyes behind rectangular glasses, and a practical olive-green field jacket worn from years of mountain research. Calm, thoughtful, and meticulous, Naomi had spent 3 decades studying groundwater systems throughout the Pacific Northwest. Evelyn had quietly consulted her years earlier, and the 2 women had remained trusted friends. I'm sorry I couldn't come before the funeral, Naomi said softly after introducing herself. You knew my grandmother? For nearly 20 years. Naomi accepted the journal Hannah handed her. After reading only a few pages, her expression changed. She really finished it. Finished what? Hannah asked. The most complete private survey of this aquifer ever made. She carefully closed the journal. If this information is accurate, your orchard sits directly above one of the purest natural spring systems in central Washington. Walter exhaled quietly. So Victor wasn't lying. No, Naomi replied. He simply wasn't telling the whole truth. She pointed toward the survey map. If a corporation controlled this water source, they could supply thousands of acres of commercial orchards, or sell the water itself. Silence settled across the room. The orchard Hannah had inherited was suddenly far more valuable and far more vulnerable than she had ever imagined. As evening settled over the Cascades, Hannah walked alone through the snow-covered rows of ancient apple trees. Wind moved gently through the bare branches while the fading sun painted the mountains gold. Only days earlier she had believed this inheritance was an accident. Now she understood something far more unsettling. Her grandmother had not simply left her an orchard. She had chosen a guardian. And somewhere beyond the frozen valley, people who had failed to convince Evelyn were already preparing to test whether her granddaughter would be any easier to break. A week after the storm, the Cascade Mountains awakened beneath brilliant winter sunshine. Fresh snow glittered across the orchard while thin streams of meltwater whispered beneath the frozen earth, hidden from every eye except those who knew where to listen. Hannah Mercer had stopped thinking of the farmhouse as an inheritance. It had become her home. Every morning began before daylight. While Walter checked the orchard fences and Ethan repaired the aging cider press, Hannah immersed herself in Evelyn's journals. Each page revealed another forgotten technique. How to press fruit slowly without bruising the flesh, how different apple varieties balanced sweetness with acidity, and how natural spring water preserved delicate aromas that factory processing often destroyed. The orchard was slowly teaching her the language her grandmother had spent a lifetime learning. One crisp morning, Ethan wheeled the restored cider press into the center of the workshop. I think she's ready, he said, wiping grease from his hands. The enormous oak flywheel turned smoothly for the first time in years. Hannah smiled. So am I. Together they carried several crates of apples from the cold storage room. None of them would ever appear on supermarket shelves. Some leaned to one side. Others carried rough skin, tiny scars, or unusual shades of crimson and gold. Yet every apple released an extraordinary fragrance the moment it was cut. Walter watched quietly from the doorway. Evelyn always said beautiful fruit feeds the eyes. He picked up one oddly shaped apple. But honest fruit feeds the soul. They washed the apples in cold spring water before feeding them slowly into the restored press. Thick golden juice flowed into polished steel containers, filling the workshop with an aroma so rich that Hannah instinctively closed her eyes. For one brief moment, she could almost imagine Evelyn standing beside them, not as a memory, as a presence. No one spoke. The silence itself felt respectful. Hours later, the first batch was finished. Hannah poured a small glass and studied the amber liquid as sunlight passed through it. Tiny particles of natural pulp drifted lazily beneath the surface, untouched by artificial filtration. She tasted it. The flavor unfolded in layers. Bright sweetness arrived first, followed by hints of honey, wildflowers, cinnamon, and a refreshing mineral finish unlike any commercial cider she had ever known. Her eyes widened. "I've never tasted anything like this." Ethan laughed softly. "Neither has anyone else." The following Saturday, they loaded only 24 glass bottles into Walter's aging pickup and drove to the Leavenworth Winter Farmers Market. Hannah expected to return home with most of them unsold. Instead, curious visitors gathered almost immediately. An elderly couple purchased the first bottle. Minutes later, they returned. "This can't be mass-produced," the woman insisted. "It tastes like the orchards my grandfather owned." Another customer asked for 3 bottles, then 6. Before noon, every bottle had disappeared. People who arrived too late began writing their names and phone numbers on scraps of paper, asking Hannah to contact them whenever another batch became available. She stared at the growing list in disbelief. "They're making a waiting list." Walter smiled proudly. "They're waiting for something real." As the afternoon crowd continued asking questions about the orchard, Hannah noticed a familiar black SUV parked quietly across the street. Victor Langford remained inside, watching, not buying, simply observing every customer who stopped at Hannah's small wooden stand. When their eyes briefly met across the snowy market square, Victor offered a polite smile. It lasted only a second. Then he drove away without speaking. Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Somewhere beyond that smile, another move had already begun. By the time they returned to the orchard that evening, the waiting list had grown to nearly 80 names. Hannah carefully placed every handwritten note inside one of Evelyn's old recipe books, almost afraid they might disappear if she looked away. Only a week earlier, she had wondered whether the orchard could survive another winter. Now strangers were asking when the next harvest would be ready, even though snow still covered every hillside. Ethan spread the empty wooden crates across the workshop floor. "We sold every bottle in less than 3 hours." Hannah smiled. "I thought people were only being polite." "They weren't buying cider," Walter replied as he hung his heavy coat beside the stove. "They were buying honesty." That night, the warmth inside the farmhouse was interrupted by the rumble of engines outside. 3 dark pickup trucks stopped along the entrance road. None of the drivers stepped onto the property. They simply remained parked for several minutes before slowly driving away again. Ethan watched through the window. "They weren't lost." "No," Walter answered quietly. "They wanted us to know they can find this place whenever they want." The following Monday, another letter arrived. Unlike Evelyn's handwritten note, this envelope carried the polished logo of Cascade Agricultural Holdings. Inside was an official legal notice. The company claimed an old easement agreement granted them access across a section of the orchard for future infrastructure surveys connected to regional agricultural development. Hannah immediately recognized the wording. "They're looking for another way in." Walter folded the papers carefully. "They're hoping you'll become tired before they become patient." Instead of answering the notice, Hannah chose to keep working. Over the next several days, she and Ethan experimented with blending different heirloom apples. One batch carried bright floral notes, but lacked depth. Another tasted wonderfully rich, but finished too sharply. Each evening, they compared handwritten notes with Evelyn's journals until one forgotten combination finally revealed itself. 3 parts mountain amber, 2 parts crimson hollow, 1 part winter gold. The result was extraordinary. The cider possessed remarkable balance, bright sweetness, gentle acidity, delicate honey aromas, and a clean mineral finish left by the ancient spring beneath the orchard. Ethan placed his glass on the table. "This one has a name." Hannah looked toward the window where fresh snow drifted between the old apple trees. Mercer Reserve. Walter smiled quietly. She would have liked that. Word spread much faster than anyone expected. A respected chef from Seattle called requesting 20 cases before the next tourist season. A specialty food store in Spokane asked for exclusive distribution rights. A travel writer published an article describing the orchard as Washington's forgotten treasure. The waiting list doubled again. Yet success brought new pressure. County inspectors suddenly appeared without notice. One examined the smoke ventilation inside the cider mill. Another measured storage temperatures. A third questioned old property boundaries dating back almost 70 years. Everything remained professional. Everything also felt unusually coordinated. After the inspectors left, Ethan noticed fresh footprints leading toward the western fence where Victor's surveyors had appeared days earlier. They're still watching. Hannah nodded. They're waiting for us to make one mistake. That evening, she walked alone through the silent orchard carrying one of Evelyn's journals beneath her arm. Snow reflected the moonlight until the entire valley shimmered like silver. She stopped beside the oldest apple tree on the property, its massive trunk twisted by more than a century of mountain winters. She rested one hand against the rough bark. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered. Wind moved softly through the bare branches above her. A single dry apple, somehow untouched by birds or storms, loosened from the highest limb and landed gently in the snow beside her boots. Hannah picked it up slowly. It wasn't perfect. Its skin carried scars earned through every season it had survived. Yet its fragrance remained wonderfully sweet. She smiled for the first time all day. Perhaps that was exactly what Evelyn had been trying to teach her. Strength was never about remaining untouched by hardship. It was about continuing to bear good fruit after enduring it. As lights glowed warmly from the farmhouse below, Hannah looked across the orchard that no longer felt abandoned. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Victor Langford was preparing his next move. But for the first time since arriving in Cascade, Hannah realized she was no longer protecting the orchard alone. An entire community, and the legacy of the woman who planted these trees, was beginning to stand beside her. The first days of spring arrived quietly in the Cascade Mountains. Snow retreated from the orchard one slow inch at a time, revealing dark earth that had waited patiently beneath winter's silence. Tiny green buds appeared along the oldest apple trees, promising that another season was ready to begin. For Hannah Mercer, however, the season brought more than blossoms. It brought a decision. The farmhouse dining table had become a command center. Evelyn's journals lay open beside geological surveys, county records, old property deeds, and photographs Ethan had taken of every page inside the hidden cellar. Walter brewed coffee almost constantly, while Dr. Naomi Ellis carefully compared Evelyn's handwritten aquifer maps with modern satellite surveys. Late one afternoon, Naomi gently closed the final notebook. She was right. Everyone looked toward her. The underground spring extends far beyond this orchard. She spread several maps across the table. If Cascade Agricultural Holdings controls this property, they'll control the primary recharge point for nearly the entire eastern watershed. Walter leaned forward. Meaning? Naomi traced a blue line with her finger. They won't just own an orchard. They'll own the future water supply for hundreds of neighboring farms. Silence filled the room. Hannah slowly looked toward Evelyn's final letter. Her grandmother had never been protecting only apple trees. She had been protecting an entire community. The following morning, Ethan unlocked another forgotten filing cabinet hidden behind shelves inside the old cider mill. Years of dust covered its rusted doors, but the lock finally gave way. Inside rested dozens of carefully organized folders. Invoices, correspondence, legal contracts, handwritten meeting notes. Near the bottom sat a thick envelope marked in Evelyn's handwriting. If honesty is ever questioned. Hannah carefully opened it. Inside were copies of letters exchanged over nearly 18 years. Every one carried Victor Langford's signature. The earliest letters sounded friendly. He offered investment, partnership, expansion. As the years passed, the tone changed. Purchase offers became demands. Demands became threats. One letter stopped Hannah completely. Without access to your spring, regional expansion will become significantly more difficult. Please reconsider before government interests become involved. Walter slowly lowered the page. He wasn't buying apples. Naomi nodded. He was chasing water all along. Ethan reached for another folder. This isn't everything. Hidden beneath the correspondence rested copies of environmental studies commissioned decades earlier. Several pages contained signatures from independent scientists confirming the exceptional purity of the underground aquifer. Others documented repeated attempts by outside corporations to obtain drilling rights surrounding Evelyn's land. Every request had been denied, not because of money, because Evelyn believed no private company should ever control something nature had created for everyone. That afternoon, Hannah made a decision that surprised even herself. We're not hiding anymore. Walter raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? She looked around the table. My grandmother spent 20 years protecting this in silence. She gently placed her hand on Evelyn's journals. I'm grateful she did. Her voice became steadier. But silence isn't protecting us anymore. The following weekend, Hannah announced an open community gathering at the orchard. No admission, no product launch, no speeches about business. Simply an invitation. Come hear the story of Mercer Orchard. The response exceeded every expectation. Families arrived carrying folding chairs. Local farmers drove tractors through muddy spring roads. Teachers, orchard workers, retired firefighters, small business owners, and even students from Leavenworth High School gathered beneath the century-old apple trees. Many had known Evelyn. Others had only heard stories. Victor Langford's black SUV appeared once again near the entrance. This time he wasn't alone. 3 company attorneys stepped out beside him carrying leather briefcases. They expected a quiet meeting. Instead, they found nearly 300 people waiting beneath the blossoming orchard. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The orchard was filled only with the gentle sound of spring wind moving through thousands of apple blossoms. Hannah stood beneath the oldest tree on the property, Evelyn's journals resting on a simple wooden table beside her. The crowd watched quietly, while Victor Langford and his attorneys remained near the back, confident that whatever this young woman planned could easily be dismissed. Hannah took a slow breath. I grew up believing my grandmother abandoned me. The admission settled heavily over the gathering. I carried that belief for 14 years. She rested one hand on the weathered journals. But after living here, after reading every page she left behind, I finally understand that she wasn't protecting herself. Her eyes moved across the familiar faces surrounding the orchard. She was protecting all of us. One by one, Hannah opened the journals, displaying Evelyn's meticulous records, geological surveys, handwritten letters, and copies of Victor Langford's proposals. Ethan connected a projector inside the old cider mill, displaying each document on a large white canvas stretched across the barn wall. Dr. Naomi Ellis calmly explained the scientific reports, describing how the underground aquifer supplied clean water to neighboring farms and helped create the unique flavor of the orchard's heirloom apples. Every new document changed the atmosphere. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Local farmers recognized property boundaries. Retired orchard owners remembered old conversations with Evelyn. Several residents quietly admitted they had received similar purchase offers years earlier. Then Walter stepped forward carrying the final envelope. He unfolded Victor's oldest letter and read it aloud. The orchard fell silent. Gone were the friendly promises of partnership. In their place stood years of pressure, intimidation, and repeated attempts to gain control of the spring beneath the land. Victor's attorneys whispered urgently among themselves. For the first time, Victor himself looked genuinely uncomfortable. Before he could speak, several marked vehicles from the Washington State Attorney General's office turned onto the Orchard Road. Investigators had received copies of every document 3 days earlier. They had already begun verifying Evelyn's records. The lead investigator approached Hannah respectfully. We'll need the originals. She smiled gently. They've been waiting for someone honest. Within hours, official notices were delivered freezing every pending land acquisition connected to Cascade Agricultural Holdings until the investigation was complete. Over the following months, investigators uncovered hidden shell companies, fraudulent land negotiations, and years of coordinated efforts to secure control of groundwater rights throughout the region. Victor Langford resigned before criminal charges were formally announced. His company dissolved soon afterward under mounting legal and financial pressure. But Hannah found little satisfaction in watching someone else's downfall. She had already discovered something far more valuable. That summer, Mercer Orchard officially reopened under a new wooden sign carved by Hannah's own hands. Mercer Orchard Reserve. Visitors arrived from across the Pacific Northwest, not only to taste the cider, but to walk through the heritage orchard, learn about heirloom apples, and understand why one woman had spent decades protecting them. Ethan became the orchard's operations director, restoring the century-old cider mill without changing its soul. Walter finally retired from daily maintenance, though he still insisted on pruning a few trees every Saturday morning simply because, as he liked to say, old habits make good company. Dr. Naomi Ellis helped establish a conservation partnership ensuring the underground spring would remain permanently protected for future generations. Every autumn, Hannah welcomed local schoolchildren into the orchard. Instead of beginning with business, she began with Evelyn's favorite lesson. She handed each child an apple that looked imperfect. Some were crooked, some were spotted, some were unusually small. Then she asked them to take one bite. Every smile that followed reminded her of the first apple Ethan had placed in her hand. Years later, a small wooden plaque appeared beside the entrance to the orchard. It carried no company logo, no awards, only a single sentence carved into cedar. The greatest treasures are rarely the ones hidden beneath the earth. They are the ones protected by people who choose future generations over themselves. On quiet evenings, Hannah often sat beneath the oldest apple tree, watching the sun disappear behind the Cascade Mountains. The wind still moved gently through the branches exactly as it had when Evelyn walked these same rows many years before. She finally understood the inheritance she had received. It had never been 80 acres of land. It had never been a cider mill. It had never even been the hidden cellar. It was a purpose. And sometimes, the greatest family legacy is not what we are given. It is what we choose to protect for those who come after us. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder from the heavens or answers that come overnight. Sometimes they grow quietly, like a forgotten apple tree surviving another harsh winter, waiting for the right season to bear fruit again. Hannah believed she had been abandoned. She thought her story began with loss. But God had been writing a much bigger story all along. One of love preserved through generations, truth protected by courage, and hope waiting beneath the surface until the right time to be revealed. In our own lives, many of us carry invisible burdens. Some are living with loneliness. Some are grieving someone they loved. Some are struggling to hold their families together. And some are wondering if anyone still remembers them. This story reminds us that God is always at work, even when we cannot see it. What feels like an ending today may simply be the beginning of a blessing that has been quietly growing for years. The doors that close may lead us to the ones God has been preparing all along. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We would love to hear your story and pray for you. And if you believe that faith, kindness, and second chances can still change lives, please subscribe to the channel and join our growing family. There are many more stories waiting to remind us that hope is never truly lost. May God bless you, bless your family, fill your home with peace, protect you wherever you go, and remind you every day that you are never walking alone. Amen.